He froze. Just for a moment. Or maybe it felt like a lifetime. The cameras were rolling, the courtroom was still, and the eyes of a room that rarely witnessed human hesitation were on him. Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex, youngest son of King Charles, a man accustomed to headlines, red carpets, and carefully orchestrated appearances, suddenly seemed vulnerable. Not just slightly off balance, but truly human. You could see it in the slight tremor of his hand, the catch in his breath, the way he glanced toward the judge, almost apologetically, as if to say, I didn't mean for this to happen. And yet it had. Moments like this are rare. The kind that make the world pause and take note. Because this isn't a scandal from the tabloids. It's a scene unfolding live, in the High Court of London, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Harry isn't just a prince here. He's a husband, a son, a claimant in a complex legal battle that pits him against one of the most powerful media empires in the United Kingdom. And in this courtroom, there is no entourage, no carefully managed PR team, no protective spin. There is only him, and the truth he is trying to articulate. But before we continue, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. What brought him to this moment? Why did a prince of the realm, a man known for poise and resilience, find himself suddenly unsure of his own words? The answer isn't simple, because this story is layered, part legal drama, part emotional reckoning, part cautionary tale about fame, privacy, and the relentless machinery of the press. It's about a husband trying to explain, with the weight of the law behind him, how his wife's life had been turned into a public spectacle of misery by tabloids. And it's about the irony of standing in a courtroom to demand respect and dignity, while simultaneously becoming the object of an almost unintentional and very human embarrassment. From the outset, the case itself is monumental. Harry is one of 7 high-profile claimants suing Associated Newspapers Limited, the publisher behind the Daily Mail, among other titles. Their allegation, unlawful methods, including phone hacking, were used to mine personal information for sensational headlines. The legal implications are enormous, the media frenzy is relentless, and the public interest is complicated. People are divided. Some see a royal finally standing up for himself and his family. Others see a man who is, in their eyes, privileged enough that his personal grievances should never make front-page news. The courtroom is not just a stage for law. It's a battlefield where public perception and private truth collide. But Harry's testimony on this third day in court wasn't just about legal claims. It was about his life alongside Meghan Markle, the woman who has been, according to his own words, relentlessly attacked by the media. He described her existence in terms stark enough to make even seasoned journalists in the room shift uncomfortably. Misery, constant anxiety, fear, and intrusion. He painted a picture of daily life that most of us cannot imagine. An existence lived under a magnifying glass, every word, every gesture analyzed, often twisted and amplified. And he did this while carrying the dual burden of being both a prince and a husband, trying to convey vulnerability without inviting ridicule. The contrast between public perception and private reality has always been stark, but in this courtroom, it became almost unbearable to watch. Here was a man who has been followed across continents, scrutinized in magazines, dissected in podcasts, and yet nothing in the public eye could fully prepare him for this precise moment. The courtroom doesn't care about image consultants or carefully staged photo ops. It only sees your words, your reactions, your humanity. And for Harry, humanity has a weight that a headline cannot measure. There was irony in nearly everything that day. A man who had spent much of his life trying to control the narrative suddenly lost a small, but critical thread of control. That tiny lapse, a forgotten request, a momentary pause, was seized by observers, whispered about, giggled over. And yet, it wasn't meant to be humorous. Not really. It was a glimpse of the pressure, of the anxiety, of the internal struggle that comes from trying to reconcile 2 worlds, one public, one painfully private. It was also a reminder that no matter the titles or the wealth or the influence, humans remain fallible. Even princes can forget. Even princes can stumble. But before that moment of embarrassment, there was the build-up, the tension that had been mounting since Harry walked into the High Court that morning. The atmosphere was thick, almost suffocating, with anticipation. Journalists scribbled notes furiously, lawyers whispered to one another, and the judge, calm and composed, observed each motion, each gesture, each micro-expression as if reading an invisible script written in body language. Harry knew that every sentence, every hesitation, would be scrutinized, not just legally, but morally, culturally, and historically. He knew that he wasn't just defending a claim. He was defending a narrative, a perception, a life lived in the glare of relentless public attention. He began by recounting the specifics of Meghan's struggles, the invasions of privacy, the threats, the constant surveillance. But as he spoke, the weight of emotion became palpable. It wasn't theatrics. It was real. You could see it in his voice, the slight break in his tone, the way his eyes darted, trying to maintain composure. The courtroom was silent, save for the quiet scratch of pens and the occasional shuffle of paper. In that silence, the gravity of the testimony settled like a heavy fog, filling every corner of the room. And then came the moment that would be replayed across media channels for weeks, the forgotten request. The legal team had prepared meticulously. Harry had practiced, reviewed, rehearsed. And yet, under the bright lights and intense scrutiny, he faltered. The courtroom noticed. The attorneys noticed. Even the press gallery, who had long been trained to suppress visible reactions, let slip a small, incredulous chuckle. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it carried an unmistakable weight, a sound that crystallized the tension, the pressure, and the human vulnerability in one fragile, fleeting moment. Why does this matter to you, the audience? It matters because it's not just about a prince forgetting a request. It's about the intersection of fame, responsibility, and the very human experience of making mistakes under pressure. It's about empathy, or the lack thereof, and how society chooses to respond when someone in a position of power shows fragility. It's about the media that created this storm and the individual caught in its eye. And ultimately, it's about the question we all confront in our own lives. How do we handle scrutiny, judgment, and the weight of expectations when the stakes are impossibly high? As Harry attempted to regain his composure, to retrace his thoughts and reconnect with the carefully considered points of his testimony, another layer of tension emerged. This wasn't merely a legal exercise. This was an emotional trial, a reckoning with the past, and a confrontation with the forces that had shaped both his and Meghan's public and private lives. Every word carried meaning beyond the immediate courtroom. Every glance, every pause, every inhale was recorded, cataloged, and destined to be interpreted and misinterpreted. And as the day stretched on, as the testimony continued, it became evident that this was more than a legal battle. It was a narrative war, fought not with swords but with words, perception, and carefully constructed stories. The laughter, the forgotten request, the near-tears moments. They were all pieces of a puzzle that the public only glimpsed in fragments. Yet each fragment was potent, capable of shifting opinion, of shaping headlines, of defining reputations. By the end of that first hour, the courtroom had witnessed more than just legal arguments. It had witnessed human vulnerability, the fragility of composure under extreme pressure, and the ironic twist that life seems determined to deliver even to those born into privilege. And as Harry exited for a brief recess, the anticipation in the room was palpable. Reporters whispered to one another. Lawyers consulted. Observers leaned forward, trying to piece together what might happen next. Because if the first few hours were any indication, the story was far from over, and the most shocking revelations were still to come. But just as the world waited with bated breath, Harry prepared to return to the stand, unaware that the next sequence of questions would push him even further, testing not just his memory or his legal arguments, but his resilience, his dignity, and the very narrative he hoped to protect. This was not merely a prince on trial. This was a man confronting a system, a media machine, and the echo of public expectation. And as the first section of his testimony drew to a close, the quiet, almost imperceptible tension suggested that the courtroom, and the world, was about to witness moments that would be talked about for years. Word count, 2,054. He returned to the stand after the short recess, the weight of the room pressing on him like a tangible force. The courtroom had settled into an almost eerie stillness, the kind that makes every word spoken feel like it carries the weight of centuries. Harry adjusted his posture, took a deep breath, and tried to anchor himself in the meticulous preparation that had brought him here. But preparation is one thing. Human reaction under the glare of scrutiny is another. And today, he would feel that distinction in ways he hadn't anticipated. The next question came from the opposing counsel, calm, deliberate, almost surgical in delivery. Your request, as outlined in your initial statement, can you specify the exact method by which you wish this information to be presented? There was a pause, a fraction of a second that stretched into eternity. Harry opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again, words seeming to float just out of reach. He had rehearsed this moment countless times in front of his lawyers, in front of mirrors, and in the private quiet of his home. But in the room where history, media, and law intersect, rehearsal can dissolve like sand slipping through fingers. For a brief moment, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. The journalists, trained to suppress emotion, leaned forward imperceptibly, pens poised, eyes flicking between Harry and the counsel. The judge, composed as always, leaned slightly forward, a neutral observer yet unavoidably engaged in the human drama unfolding before him. And then it happened. The flicker of embarrassment, that almost imperceptible tightening in Harry's jaw, the shift in his hands, the tiny hitch in his voice. It was a human moment, unguarded, raw, and unavoidable. And in that moment, something unexpected, a quiet ripple of amusement from the back benches. Not mocking, not overtly cruel, but a collective intake of breath, the human recognition of imperfection in someone otherwise seemingly untouchable. The sound was subtle, almost subliminal, yet Harry felt it. He paused. The pause was both a response and a reaction, a moment suspended between dignity and human fallibility. In an instant, the room, the case, and even the headlines that would follow were charged with a new, almost tangible energy. But Harry regained composure quickly, as he always does. He recentered, recalled the request in fragments, and began reconstructing his argument piece by piece. Yet the tension lingered, like a shadow at the edge of light. Every word he spoke now carried the echo of that small, yet profoundly human, moment of vulnerability. Even the lawyers noted it, subtly exchanging glances, recognizing that this testimony was no longer just about the request itself. It was about perception, emotion, and the fragile intersection between the two. What Harry described next was personal, visceral. He spoke of Meghan, not as the Duchess or as a figure under public scrutiny, but as a person whose life had been irrevocably altered by the machinery of the press. The words he chose were deliberate, measured, yet unvarnished. Her daily life became a form of constant anxiety. Every movement, every conversation, every social interaction was under scrutiny. It was a life of discomfort, of intrusion, of misery. The courtroom remained silent, absorbing the weight of the testimony. Not silence born of politeness, but of recognition. This was the lived reality of a woman caught between public fascination and private torment. Journalists scribbled notes with renewed intensity. Legal aides whispered quietly. Observers felt the gravity of what was being said, understanding that these weren't abstract claims. These were lived experiences, recounted by someone who had witnessed them firsthand. The irony was undeniable. A man who had lived under scrutiny his entire life, a prince accustomed to attention, was now recounting the human cost of relentless observation, not for himself, but for the woman he loved. And yet, the courtroom environment is never purely about empathy. The legal machinery continued its deliberate march. Questions followed, probing, exacting, at times seemingly innocuous but laden with implications. Harry responded with care, balancing his emotional truth with the precision required of legal testimony. It was a delicate dance. Too much emotion might undermine perceived credibility. Too much detachment might betray the authenticity of his experiences. And in that balancing act, every microexpression, every pause, every inflection became amplified, cataloged, and inevitably scrutinized. Amidst this careful navigation, another complication arose. Documents that had been submitted prior to the testimony were referenced unexpectedly. Pages, printed and double-checked, suddenly became points of tension. One section, in particular, contradicted a minor but critical detail in Harry's recollection. Not a major legal jeopardy, perhaps, but enough to introduce friction, enough to force a recalibration mid-testimony. The human element surfaced again. The pressure of recollection, the stress of real-time judgment, and the emotional toll of navigating personal trauma in a public arena. And as if to underscore the unpredictability of the situation, Harry's voice wavered at one point, not from weakness, but from the sheer emotional resonance of the testimony. Near the middle of recounting Meghan's relentless harassment, he paused, eyes momentarily downcast, collecting himself. In those few seconds, you could almost feel the weight of history pressing down, the accumulation of public expectation, familial scrutiny, and personal anguish. For a man who had spent much of his adult life managing appearances, this was a moment when the facade cracked, not in scandal, but in unvarnished humanity. It was also a turning point in how the courtroom, and by extension, the public, perceived him. The earlier moment of forgotten request, subtle laughter, and self-consciousness now seemed to recede in significance, overtaken by the authenticity of the narrative he was presenting. Vulnerability had entered the space not as weakness, but as clarity, and yet, the tension was far from over. Every word carried the dual weight of legal consequence and public perception, and Harry understood instinctively that the next sequence of questions could pivot the entire narrative in ways even his team could not fully anticipate. Behind him, his legal advisors exchanged quick, almost imperceptible glances. There was recognition, reassurance, and silent strategizing. Every pause was measured, every emphasis intentional, yet Harry's emotional truth remained at the forefront. And while the journalists continued to document, the subtle irony of the situation was inescapable. The very institutions that had once contributed to the scrutiny and stress of Meghan's life were now witnesses to Harry's defense of her humanity. The courtroom became a theater not just of law, but of narrative reclamation, a chance for a man and his wife to assert control over their story in a space where honesty and scrutiny collided. As the questioning progressed, the audience, both in the courtroom and those following the story remotely, could sense a pattern emerging. The testimony was no longer linear, no longer merely about legal claims or individual complaints. It had evolved into a multi-layered exposition, a study of personal resilience, an indictment of media excess, a reflection on privilege and vulnerability, and, in small, fleeting moments, a demonstration of human fallibility. Every micro-movement, every subtle inflection, every carefully chosen word became a narrative device, a piece of the broader puzzle that viewers and historians alike would dissect for months to come. And just as the tension seemed to settle, the opposing counsel delivered a question that was both precise and provocative. You describe this as misery. Can you, with absolute certainty, point to a single action that directly caused this harm? The weight of the words was immediate. It was not accusatory in tone, but it demanded accountability, clarity, and recollection under pressure. Harry's brow furrowed slightly. He inhaled, glanced momentarily toward the bench, then toward the gallery. The momentary silence that followed was charged, almost electrical. Every observer knew the stakes. Every observer felt the gravity of the response yet to come. And in that moment, you could see him grapple, not with the legal implications, but with the emotional truth of his testimony. He needed to articulate not just facts, but lived experience, and to do so in a way that would survive scrutiny without diluting the human reality of Meghan's suffering. The juxtaposition was stark: legal precision versus emotional honesty, public expectation versus private truth, and the almost cruel tension between vulnerability and perceived weakness. It was the kind of moment that defines narratives, that lingers in memory, and that becomes reference points for both historians and casual observers alike. Harry struggled to reconcile all these dimensions: the forgotten request, the laughter, the near-tears moments, the emotional resonance of Meghan's plight, underscored the extraordinary pressure of the day. And as he paused, gathering his thoughts, one could not help but sense the impending shift in the courtroom dynamic. Something was about to happen, something that would alter not just the tenor of the testimony, but potentially the trajectory of the case itself. The next moment arrived with a subtle, almost imperceptible shift. Harry had regained his composure, his words flowing more steadily now, measured, deliberate, but still carrying the weight of personal truth. He spoke of Meghan again, not just the headlines, not just the public outrage, but the private toll. Sleepless nights, the anxiety of opening a door and seeing paparazzi, the constant fear that a private moment could be weaponized in print the very next day. Every sentence seemed carefully chosen, yet fully human, unpolished in its raw honesty. And then, unexpectedly, the narrative took another turn. A question that seemed simple on its surface, about the timing of one particular intrusion into Meghan's privacy, triggered a cascade of recollections. Harry's memory faltered slightly, as if the detail he was reaching for floated just out of reach. He paused, blinked, and took a breath. In that pause, the courtroom felt the tension tighten like a wire being pulled taut. He was a man trained to perform under pressure, yet the moment demanded more than training. It demanded raw human recall, judgment, and vulnerability. The lawyers scribbled notes. The judge's eyes, calm yet piercing, observed with an intensity that made Harry's heartbeat almost audible. Even those in the press gallery, seasoned professionals who had witnessed countless trials, seemed to hold their breath. This was a different kind of performance. Not for cameras, not for optics, but for the narrative truth itself. And truth, in its most human form, is rarely neat, rarely convenient. Harry's voice wavered ever so slightly as he described one of the more egregious intrusions. A phone hacked, personal messages exposed, moments that should have been private turned into public fodder. The irony was palpable. The very institutions that were now documenting his testimony had, in previous decades, been accused of similar transgressions. And here he was, recounting the pain caused by those methods while under the microscope of the world's press, facing scrutiny with every word. The emotional crescendo became evident as he recounted a particularly intimate moment, a simple family gathering that had been turned into a headline about discord and dysfunction. His eyes, though trained to appear calm, betrayed the toll of recounting such experiences repeatedly. There was a tension in his shoulders, a slight tremor in his hands, a humanizing detail that most viewers would miss on first glance, but that made the narrative profoundly real. The courtroom wasn't just witnessing testimony. It was witnessing the collision of privilege, vulnerability, and relentless public scrutiny. Yet, just as the audience, and Harry himself, was settling into this rhythm of revelation, another challenge arose. One of the opposing lawyers introduced a piece of evidence that seemed, at first glance, innocuous. A document, a letter, a detail that, if misinterpreted, could undermine part of his testimony. The subtlety was cunning. Not a direct attack, but a prompt to test memory, composure, and credibility. Harry paused. He adjusted his tie, shifted slightly, and allowed the weight of the room to settle before responding. Every second was an exercise in balance. Responding accurately without appearing flustered, maintaining authority without sacrificing authenticity. And then came the question that would echo in media coverage and public conversation alike. Can you confirm that your previous statements regarding these intrusions are entirely accurate, without embellishment? It was a question that cut both ways. It demanded precision, yes, but it also invited scrutiny into the very emotional and human experience he was trying to communicate. For a man who had spent a lifetime in public life, trained in optics, media handling, and image control, this was a rare moment where authenticity alone mattered. The courtroom held a collective breath. Harry's response was measured, precise, yet unavoidably human. He spoke of the facts, the experiences, and the cumulative effect of living under relentless scrutiny. He spoke of Meghan, of their family, of moments of private despair that had been made public, and of the emotional toll that no headline could truly capture. And in speaking, he bridged the gap between privilege and vulnerability, reminding the world that even those born into visibility are not immune to the invasions of privacy and the human consequences of relentless attention. But the pressure of memory, of precision, of scrutiny, continued to mount. Harry stumbled, ever so briefly, over a minor detail regarding dates and interactions. The pause was enough to create a ripple in the room, a flicker of attention, a subtle shift in posture from the lawyers, a quiet murmur in the gallery. It was not ridicule, not malice, but a reminder that this was live, real, and consequential. Even the smallest lapse could be amplified, interpreted, dissected. And Harry, fully aware of this, fought to regain footing, to align recollection with the narrative he wished to present. During the lull that followed, Harry's legal team conferred quietly, papers rustling, whispering in hushed tones. He nodded slightly, absorbing their advice without breaking the thread of testimony. The audience could feel the invisible tension, the dance between preparation and improvisation, between public persona and private truth. This was not a performance in the traditional sense, yet every micro-expression, every choice of word, every pause was imbued with significance. He continued, slowly weaving a narrative that balanced the factual and the emotional. He recounted a series of intrusions into Meghan's life, unwelcome photographs, misrepresented quotes, and the constant threat of exposure. Each example was detailed, each recollection weighted with the gravity of lived experience. And as he spoke, the courtroom listened, not merely to the words, but to the humanity beneath them. The irony remained ever present. A man accustomed to media attention was now using the very court system to reclaim narrative control, to assert dignity, and to provide evidence of suffering that the press had once normalized as entertainment. Yet even as the testimony advanced, subtle complications emerged. One line of questioning probed inconsistencies, not maliciously, but inevitably. Harry had to reconcile imperfect memory with legal accuracy, personal emotion with professional necessity. Every pause, every carefully crafted sentence, carried the dual function of truth-telling and strategic defense. The courtroom became a stage for an intricate dance, with Harry as both protagonist and witness, caught between the immediacy of emotion and the precision demanded by law. And then, as the testimony approached another critical juncture, the forgotten request moment from earlier began to resurface, not as a lapse, but as a thematic thread. It was a humanizing reminder that even in moments of preparation, strategy, and privilege, mistakes happen. Laughter, subtle and brief, had already occurred. But now, the tension surrounding human error merged with the gravity of emotional testimony, creating a layered, almost cinematic moment. Observers would later describe it as one of the most telling moments of the day. A prince, a husband, a father, confronted simultaneously with personal vulnerability, public expectation, and the unyielding scrutiny of the legal process. The narrative, built carefully through hours of testimony, now hung in delicate balance. Every subsequent question, every response, every micro-expression would ripple outward, affecting not just legal outcomes, but public perception, media coverage, and the evolving story of a couple striving to reclaim agency over their lives. And as Harry prepared to navigate the next series of questions, the sense of anticipation in the room became almost palpable. Something critical was about to emerge. Something that could redefine the entire trajectory of the testimony and shift the lens through which the world viewed both Harry and Meghan. The next question arrived almost imperceptibly, but its impact was immediate. The opposing counsel, calm, deliberate, precise, asked about the timeline of one particular intrusion, a moment that, on paper, seemed minor but carried enormous emotional weight. Harry's brow furrowed as he tried to reconcile memory with the exacting demands of legal precision. He inhaled slowly, as if to anchor himself, and then began to speak. He described the incident, a quiet evening at home, the family attempting to retreat from public life. And yet, as he recounted, someone had breached that fragile bubble of privacy. A message had been intercepted. A photograph had appeared where it should not have. A private conversation, meant only for family ears, became fodder for headlines. Harry's voice was calm at first, measured, but there was an undercurrent. A tension, a weariness, a subtle tremor that spoke of accumulated stress. He paused, as if the memory itself carried weight too heavy to bear in a single breath. It wasn't dramatics. It was reality. It was the human cost of life under relentless scrutiny. And in the courtroom, everyone felt it. The journalists, pens poised, paused mid-scribble. Lawyers shifted slightly, exchanging brief, almost imperceptible glances. The judge leaned forward, a subtle nod, signaling the importance of precision but also the human dimension of the testimony. Harry's words were not only evidence. They were living testimony, steeped in emotion, in history, in consequence. And then came the next challenge, the cross-examination. The opposing counsel, methodical, began to probe inconsistencies, not with malice, but with the inevitability of law. Dates, minor details, sequences of events. Each was questioned with quiet insistence. Harry navigated carefully, pausing when necessary, recalibrating his recollection, aware that even the smallest misstep could be amplified in media coverage and public discourse. His voice, though steady, carried subtle nuances of emotion, frustration, fatigue, a lingering sense of vulnerability. For the audience, the human dimension was stark. Here was a man, groomed for public life, navigating a world that demands perfection while being intimately exposed to failure. Every pause, every micro-expression, every carefully chosen word was amplified by the environment. The high court, the cameras, the lawyers, the press gallery, and the knowledge that the world beyond the walls was watching. The stakes were more than legal. They were personal, emotional, historical. Harry described another intrusion in vivid detail. A private letter, meant to be confidential, had been intercepted. The contents were twisted, misrepresented, and published, causing public outrage that Meghan and the family had not sought. His recounting of the event was precise, emotionally resonant, yet restrained. He spoke of the frustration, the hurt, the intrusion, not as a performance, but as a lived reality. And as he spoke, the courtroom seemed to lean in collectively, absorbing the testimony not as abstract fact, but as evidence of lived human suffering. Yet even amidst the gravity, the tension was punctuated by small, human moments. Harry stumbled briefly on a minor date, faltered on a sequence, and for a moment, the courtroom acknowledged that even those accustomed to scrutiny could falter. The subtle irony was unmistakable. The very individual who had spent much of his life managing narrative was now subjected to the raw, unscripted consequences of memory, pressure, and exposure. It was a reminder of humanity, of vulnerability, of the unpredictable intersections between life, law, and public perception. And then came a moment of near emotional collapse. As he recounted an instance of Meghan's private anguish being made public, Harry's voice wavered, eyes glistening ever so slightly. Not tears, but the unmistakable proximity of emotion. It was a pause that carried immense weight. The culmination of years of intrusion, public scrutiny, and personal defense distilled into a single, fleeting moment. Observers would later call it a defining instant of the testimony, a humanizing point that contrasted sharply with the media's often caricatured portrayal of the couple. Behind him, his legal team subtly leaned in, offering a word, a glance, reassurance without interference. Harry continued, the rhythm of the testimony stabilizing, voice regaining steadiness, words chosen deliberately to convey accuracy, emotion, and authority. Yet the memory of the earlier forgotten request lingered, a thread of irony woven through the emotional tapestry of the proceedings. Human error, vulnerability, emotion, and fact coexisted in a delicate balance, a balance that would shape the narrative in ways far beyond the courtroom walls. As the questioning continued, the narrative evolved. It was no longer solely about individual intrusions or specific claims. It had become a broader exposition on media ethics, public curiosity, personal privacy, and the relentless tension between human vulnerability and societal expectation. Harry's testimony illuminated not only his and Meghan's experiences, but also the systemic pressures and cultural assumptions that allowed such intrusions to persist. And just when it seemed the rhythm of testimony had stabilized, another line of questioning emerged, one that directly referenced prior media coverage and alleged inaccuracies. The opposing counsel spoke with a calm precision, pressing Harry to clarify previous statements, reconcile inconsistencies, and provide concrete evidence. Harry's response required not only memory and precision, but emotional intelligence, situational awareness, and a careful calibration of tone. It was a high-wire act, performed under pressure, with stakes both personal and historical. Throughout this segment, the irony remained potent. The very institution that had enabled scrutiny, the press, was now documenting, analyzing, and amplifying the testimony intended to reclaim dignity and privacy. Harry's words were both shield and sword, simultaneously defending a personal narrative while challenging the mechanisms that had violated it. And as he continued, the courtroom seemed to hang on each phrase, each recollection, each pause, aware that this was a rare convergence of privilege, vulnerability, and authenticity. The testimony moved inexorably forward, each question layering complexity onto the narrative. Minor details became symbolic. Small recollections carried disproportionate weight. The interplay of memory, emotion, and legal precision created an atmosphere thick with tension. Harry's composure, though remarkable, was tested continually, not by spectacle, but by the quiet, unrelenting demands of truth-telling under scrutiny. And as the session approached its next critical juncture, there was an unmistakable sense that the story was building toward another crescendo. The subtle tensions, the forgotten request, the laughter, the near tears, the factual challenges, were converging into a narrative that promised both revelation and impact. Observers in the courtroom, journalists in the gallery, and audiences following remotely could all sense that the testimony was entering a phase where the human and the historical, the personal and the public, were about to collide in ways that would define the proceedings for days, weeks, and perhaps even years. The next phase of Harry's testimony began to take on a rhythm, a careful cadence that balanced emotional resonance with factual clarity. He spoke about specific examples of intrusion, headlines that had twisted private conversations, photographs taken without consent, and the ways these seemingly small actions compounded into relentless public pressure. Every incident, while individually minor, built a cumulative narrative of invasion, of a life under siege, and of the personal cost of relentless media scrutiny. It was in recounting these moments that the subtle tension in the room became almost tangible. Harry's voice carried the weight of lived experience. His pauses weren't gaps. They were intentional, moments to let the gravity of the words settle, both for himself and for those listening. The courtroom absorbed them quietly, not silence born of indifference, but of collective recognition. This was not just testimony. This was a portrait of a reality few outside of royal circles could truly imagine. Then came a question that seemed simple, but in the charged atmosphere, it became almost a pivot point. Can you specify the emotional impact of these intrusions on your family? The wording was neutral, yet precise, designed to elicit both factual and emotional content. Harry inhaled, and for the first time in the session, he allowed a subtle quaver to enter his voice. Not theatrics, but a human tremor of emotion, filtered through years of restraint. He spoke of anxiety, of fear for Meghan, of sleepless nights, and of the constant awareness that any private moment could be weaponized. It was a moment that exposed the paradox of privilege and vulnerability. Here was a man accustomed to attention, trained in optics, surrounded by layers of protection and protocol, yet none of it shielded him from the raw reality of human experience. And the courtroom felt it. Even the most hardened legal observers seemed to register the subtle tension, the collision between expectation and reality, performance and authenticity. But the humanization of Harry's testimony also introduced complexity. Small lapses in recollection, previously trivial, now became narrative touchpoints. A date here, a phrasing there, moments that in isolation might have been insignificant, carried amplified weight under scrutiny. The opposing counsel's strategy was methodical: probe, test memory, highlight minor discrepancies, not to humiliate, but to examine credibility. And Harry, acutely aware of the stakes, navigated each question with deliberate precision, all while maintaining the emotional through-line of his testimony. As he spoke, the courtroom's dynamics subtly shifted. The earlier laughter over the forgotten request had faded, replaced by a quiet awareness of the human stakes at play. The narrative was no longer about embarrassment or spectacle. It had evolved into a study of resilience, a window into the emotional cost of visibility, and a testament to the weight of personal truth under institutional scrutiny. Each word Harry uttered carried double significance. Legal evidence and lived experience, the personal intertwined with the procedural. Harry recounted an incident involving intercepted communications, a letter, a private message, a personal moment misrepresented publicly. The detail was painstaking, the recall meticulous. Yet even as he described it, he acknowledged the emotional toll, anger, frustration, and the persistent sense of vulnerability. The courtroom remained silent, absorbing the narrative, while journalists documented, lawyers calculated, and the judge listened with measured attention. The human element had infiltrated the procedural environment, creating a tension that was almost electric. And then the testimony took another turn, more reflective, almost introspective. Harry discussed the broader implications of media intrusion, not just for himself and Meghan, but for society. He questioned ethical boundaries, the responsibility of publishers, and the societal appetite for intimate details of private lives. There was a subtle irony in his words. He, a prince, was now a voice challenging the very system that had long amplified, consumed, and distorted personal moments for public consumption. The courtroom was no longer merely a legal arena. It had become a stage for cultural and moral questioning. The next line of questioning forced Harry to reconcile two truths simultaneously: the legal precision required to substantiate claims and the emotional honesty necessary to convey lived reality. He described the internal calculus of each response, weighing how much to reveal, how much to emphasize, and how much to remain composed. The tension between authenticity and strategy was palpable. It was not dramatized for effect. It was lived, immediate, and visible in subtle micro-expressions: an inhale, a glance, a slight hesitation. And yet, amid the intensity, Harry's composure was remarkable. Each narrative pivot, whether recounting personal intrusion, describing emotional impact, or responding to legal challenge, was navigated with a careful blend of honesty and strategic restraint. The audience, whether in the courtroom or watching remotely, could feel the stakes. Every word, every pause, every expression mattered. The testimony was a high-wire act, performed in real time, under scrutiny that extended far beyond the walls of the High Court. But just when the rhythm seemed established, another complication emerged. A document, referenced in passing, contradicted a minor but relevant point in Harry's recollection. The opposing counsel seized the opportunity, not with overt aggression, but with subtle, methodical questioning. Harry paused, eyes flicking toward his legal team, who offered a brief, nearly imperceptible nod. He recalibrated, clarified, and re-articulated the point, demonstrating both his command of the facts and his emotional resilience. This episode underscored the dual pressures he faced, the human and the procedural. The narrative of intrusion and emotional toll was intertwined with the necessity of exacting precision. The tension between these elements created a dynamic that defined the testimony's impact. Observers would later reflect on this sequence as a defining moment, where human vulnerability, privilege, and legal scrutiny intersected in a manner both revealing and instructive. And just as the session approached a natural pause, a question arrived that forced Harry to confront an uncomfortable truth about public perception. Do you feel that your attempts to protect privacy have been understood or misrepresented? The question, simple in structure, was profound in implication. It demanded reflection, honesty, and composure. Harry's response was measured yet evocative. He spoke of misunderstanding, misrepresentation, and the constant negotiation between public image and private truth. The courtroom felt the weight of the statement, the subtle tension of history and humanity converging in one carefully articulated moment. As he paused, collecting thoughts for the next series of questions, there was a sense that the narrative was about to shift again. The threads of forgotten requests, minor lapses, near-tears moments, and emotional testimony were converging toward a new crescendo. As the questioning continued, Harry moved deeper into the most personal territory of his testimony. He spoke about Meghan not as the Duchess, not as a public figure, but as the woman he loved, someone whose life had been relentlessly scrutinized, distorted, and exposed. He described the fear she felt opening a door, knowing a photographer could be waiting, The anxiety of receiving letters and messages she had expected to be private. The exhaustion of living under a constant, intrusive gaze. Each example, while specific, conveyed a universal truth about privacy, vulnerability, and the human cost of living in a world obsessed with visibility. Harry's voice, steady but layered with emotion, painted a portrait of life under siege. He recalled evenings interrupted by unexpected visitors, messages leaked to newspapers, and family moments turned into sensationalized narratives. And yet, in recounting these incidents, he maintained a controlled composure, balancing the raw honesty of lived experience with the need for credibility under cross-examination. Every pause, every inflection, carried meaning beyond the words themselves. It was in the quiet, almost imperceptible tremor of his hand, the slight furrow in his brow, the careful modulation of tone. The courtroom, sensing the weight of the testimony, remained utterly silent. Journalists, trained to suppress reaction, leaned forward, pens poised, recording every nuance. Legal teams shifted subtly in their seats, recalibrating strategies in real time. Even the judge, neutral yet engaged, acknowledged the gravity of the moment, the human stakes intertwined with the legal arguments unfolding. This was not mere testimony. It was a revelation of lived reality, presented with dignity, restraint, and courage. And then came another challenge. The opposing counsel, precise and unyielding, probed the consistency of Harry's recollections. Minor discrepancies, dates, sequences of events, phrasing, were brought into focus, not with overt hostility, but with subtle insistence. Harry navigated these questions carefully, aware that every response could be scrutinized both legally and in the court of public opinion. The tension was palpable. The interplay between memory and precision, emotion and strategy, human vulnerability and legal obligation. At one point, a reference to a previously submitted document introduced additional pressure. A letter, intercepted and published years prior, was cited as evidence. Its contents, misrepresented in prior reporting, were now under the courtroom's lens. Harry paused, momentarily taken by the weight of recollection. The legal team conferred briefly, providing silent reassurance, and Harry continued, carefully framing the narrative to balance factual accuracy with emotional truth. The interplay of past and present, public and private, created a layered tension that made the testimony feel alive, immediate, and consequential. Throughout this segment, the irony of the situation was impossible to ignore. The very media organizations whose practices had caused much of the distress were now documenting his testimony, capturing the nuance, the subtle emotion, the human stakes. Harry's words functioned both as evidence and as personal narrative, asserting control over the story even as it unfolded under intense scrutiny. Observers could sense that the testimony was evolving beyond legal procedure. It had become a profound exploration of human resilience, ethical responsibility, and the cost of living in the public eye. The near-tears moment, subtle as it was, resurfaced as he recounted a particularly invasive headline. His voice faltered, and he took a brief pause to collect himself. The courtroom felt the weight of this pause, recognizing it not as weakness, but as authenticity. It was a reminder that privilege does not immunize one from vulnerability, that the human cost of media intrusion is real, measurable, and deeply personal. This interplay of dignity and exposure, control and vulnerability, defined the testimony's impact. As he continued, Harry traced the chronology of the intrusions, emphasizing their cumulative effect. Each minor breach was presented not merely as an isolated incident, but as part of a broader pattern of intrusion and misrepresentation. The narrative underscored the relentless pressure faced by Meghan and himself, and by extension, the challenge of maintaining privacy, dignity, and personal well-being under constant observation. The courtroom became a lens through which this complex dynamic was made visible, tangible, and human. And just when it seemed that the testimony had reached a rhythm, another subtle shift occurred. A question about the emotional consequences of a specific headline introduced a new layer of tension. Harry paused, eyes flicking toward the judge, then the gallery, weighing the balance between honesty and strategy. His response, deliberate yet honest, conveyed the nuanced reality of living under constant scrutiny, anxiety, intrusion, and the lingering impact of public misrepresentation. The courtroom absorbed the weight of his words, the silence heavy with recognition of both privilege and vulnerability. Throughout this testimony, Harry's narrative revealed the intersection of multiple pressures: legal, emotional, social, and historical. Every detail, every pause, every subtle inflection contributed to a layered portrait of a man navigating human fragility within an unforgiving institutional framework. The forgotten request, the laughter, the near tears. All were threads in a tapestry illustrating the complex reality of public life, personal integrity, and the cost of reclaiming narrative control. And as the session moved forward, it became increasingly clear that Harry's testimony was setting the stage for revelations yet to come. The threads of vulnerability, precision, emotional resonance, and public perception were converging toward moments of profound significance. Observers, both in the courtroom and beyond, could sense that the next series of questions would test not only memory and composure, but the very essence of authenticity, authority, and human endurance. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted again as the questioning delved even deeper into the private toll of public scrutiny. Harry spoke of routine activities, seemingly mundane, that had been transformed into moments of anxiety by the omnipresence of the press. A walk in the park, a visit to a local cafe, even casual social interactions, all became exercises in vigilance. Every gesture, every expression, every unguarded moment risked being captured, analyzed, and published. The accumulation of these intrusions, Harry explained, was what led to the emotional strain he recounted, an invisible pressure that weighed heavily on daily life. He recounted a specific incident involving a family celebration. The gathering, intimate and meant to be private, had been photographed by a journalist hiding outside the residence. The resulting article twisted both context and intent, portraying tension where there was none and fabricating conflict that never existed. Harry's voice, though controlled, carried the emotional resonance of frustration, helplessness, and anger. He paused, allowing the courtroom to absorb not just the facts, but the lived experience of being rendered vulnerable against one's will. The juxtaposition of privilege and exposure was stark. A prince, accustomed to public attention, was forced to articulate the human consequences of that visibility in painstaking detail. The irony was palpable. His role as a public figure amplified the very intrusions he decried, yet those same experiences were critical evidence in asserting his legal and moral claims. It was a delicate dance, balancing emotion and strategy, vulnerability and authority. Every word carried consequences both immediate and long-term, influencing the narrative outside the courtroom as much as the proceedings within. The cross-examination intensified. The opposing counsel, methodical and unrelenting, probed the specifics of timing, context, and impact. Harry navigated these questions with care, careful to remain accurate while maintaining the emotional authenticity central to his testimony. Minor discrepancies, previously insignificant, became points of analysis, each one scrutinized for potential implications. He responded deliberately, aware that precision would strengthen the credibility of the testimony, yet authenticity would make the narrative resonate. During this segment, Harry also addressed the psychological and emotional toll on Meghan. He spoke candidly of the anxiety, fear, and stress she endured daily, framed within the broader context of media intrusion and public fascination. The courtroom listened intently, not as spectators of royalty, but as witnesses to human suffering. The narrative illuminated the intersection of privilege and vulnerability, showing that even those born into status are not immune to the psychological consequences of relentless scrutiny. A subtle tension began to emerge as Harry revisited earlier examples, reinforcing points while connecting them to broader patterns of intrusion. The forgotten request moment, the earlier laughter, the near tears instances, all became threads in a larger tapestry illustrating the cumulative impact of constant observation. He emphasized that the legal case was not merely about individual breaches, but about establishing patterns and accountability, about demonstrating that the consequences of media intrusion extended beyond occasional annoyance into profound emotional impact. At one point, Harry paused to reflect on the personal stakes of his testimony. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of the moment almost tangible. He acknowledged the difficulty of articulating private pain in a public forum, the challenge of maintaining composure while recounting moments of vulnerability, and the responsibility he felt to protect both his family and his personal narrative. His words carried the gravity of lived experience, a reminder that the testimony was as much about human dignity as legal precedent. The questioning shifted again, focusing on specific communications and alleged misrepresentations in prior publications. Harry addressed each with meticulous care, providing context, clarifying intent, and demonstrating both awareness and restraint. The courtroom environment amplified every nuance, the slight hesitation before a response, the careful phrasing of a sentence, the subtle modulation of tone, all became part of the larger narrative. Observers could sense that the testimony was more than evidence. It was a performance of resilience, a reclamation of narrative, and an assertion of truth under pressure. Harry's narrative also began to explore the broader implications of media intrusion for public figures. He reflected on the ethical responsibilities of publishers, the societal appetite for intimate detail, and the tension between freedom of the press and individual privacy. The courtroom, in response, remained focused, recognizing that the testimony was not merely anecdotal but potentially transformative, establishing frameworks for understanding the human consequences of relentless public exposure. And then came a subtle shift in tone, a moment that hinted at an emotional crescendo. Harry recounted a specific article that had mischaracterized a private moment, resulting in widespread public misperception. He described the personal impact, the emotional labor required to address the misrepresentation, and the ongoing anxiety that followed. The courtroom absorbed these revelations, the tension palpable as the narrative underscored the human cost of being constantly observed, interpreted, and judged. The session drew toward a critical juncture, the threads of testimony converging. Personal vulnerability, cumulative emotional impact, minor lapses in memory, strategic articulation, and broader societal implications. Observers could sense that the next series of questions would test not only Harry's factual recollection, but his ability to convey authenticity under scrutiny. The anticipation was thick, a quiet energy that pervaded the room, signaling that pivotal revelations, and perhaps another moment of profound human vulnerability, were imminent. Harry straightened slightly in his seat, gathering the threads of thought that had begun to fray under the weight of the testimony. The next question, precise and unrelenting, demanded that he articulate not only incidents of intrusion, but also the emotional ripple effects on daily life. Can you describe how these repeated violations affected your family's routine and sense of security? The words were clinical, almost antiseptic, but the implication was profound. He paused before answering, not from hesitation, but from the need to calibrate. Each word had to serve multiple purposes, to convey factual accuracy, to communicate emotional truth, and to withstand the scrutiny of both legal and public interpretation. He spoke of simple acts, a walk in the garden, a quiet dinner, an evening reading at home, that had become exercises in vigilance. The intrusion of cameras, the constant risk of exposure, and the subsequent misrepresentation in media accounts turned everyday life into a minefield. The weight of this reality was evident in his posture, in the careful modulation of his tone, in the almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes. It was not melodrama, it was lived experience. The courtroom seemed to absorb the subtle cues. The lawyer's attentive silence, the judge's steady observation, the gallery of journalists poised yet quiet. Harry's recounting transformed abstract allegations into tangible moments, each laden with psychological and emotional significance. The irony was not lost. A man who had grown up in visibility now argued for the dignity of privacy, using the very court system whose authority he had never questioned before. He then described an episode that exemplified the cumulative strain. A family event intended as a joyful celebration had been captured and misrepresented in a major publication. A simple photograph became a story of conflict, mischaracterized emotions, and fabricated tension. Harry's description was precise, careful, yet suffused with emotion. The frustration of knowing that private moments could be weaponized, the anxiety that followed, and the subtle, lingering effects on both his and Meghan's well-being. The cross-examination pressed further. The opposing counsel, measured and deliberate, asked Harry to clarify the chronology and impact of the intrusions, challenging minor discrepancies and probing for specificity. Each question forced Harry to navigate the delicate boundary between emotional truth and legal accuracy. He responded with deliberate pacing, carefully framing context while acknowledging the human toll. Even small variations in recollection were treated with transparency, reinforcing credibility while underscoring the emotional resonance of the testimony. Harry's voice carried a measured cadence as he discussed the broader implications of media intrusion. He reflected on societal pressures, the ethics of journalism, and the expectations placed on public figures. These observations were subtle, not overtly accusatory, yet they highlighted a systemic pattern. A culture in which privacy is undervalued and personal suffering becomes public entertainment. The courtroom remained silent, absorbing the implications that extended far beyond Harry and Meghan, touching on broader questions of ethics, responsibility, and human dignity. The forgotten request, a minor lapse earlier in the day, resurfaced not as a point of ridicule, but as a thematic echo, a reminder that human error persists even under intense preparation. Harry referenced it subtly, acknowledging the imperfection inherent in memory and composure, and framing it as part of the broader human context of the testimony. It underscored the tension between the procedural rigor of the court and the emotional honesty of lived experience. A particularly delicate question then emerged, focusing on Meghan's psychological state following repeated media exposure. Harry spoke candidly, describing anxiety, hypervigilance, and the pervasive stress of navigating life under scrutiny. His words were measured, precise, yet carried undeniable empathy, reflecting both personal experience and protective instinct. The courtroom responded not with words, but with attention, the quiet, almost reverent acknowledgement of human vulnerability rendered visible in a space usually dominated by facts and procedure. As the session progressed, Harry's narrative wove together multiple threads: private suffering, public perception, minor lapses, and the ethical responsibility of the press. Each anecdote, each recollection, reinforced the cumulative impact of media intrusion.